The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, guys. Let me remind you where we stand, and I'll give you a kind of quick overview of where we're going to go. I'm going to say a few more things briefly about the idea of representation, to review some obvious stuff, but that clearly not everybody, what used to be obvious to undergraduates when I was an undergraduate in the Middle Ages, but may not be so obvious now. And then I want to go on to try to do what we've been postponing for a long time, which is to do a quick comparison between two episodes, between one episode of The Honeymooners and one of I Love Lucy, to strengthen and fortify the argument we'd made before about the necessity at certain points in this project of understanding television of bringing evaluative criteria to bear. In other words, remember, I'm not saying that these aesthetically evaluative procedures, that is, say, trying to tell whether a television fiction is artistically good or not, is artistically excellent or not. I'm not saying that that enterprise is essential to all the ways in which, to all the projects that and procedures we might commit ourselves in order to understand television fully. But it is part of the project and a crucial part of the project. The project would be incomplete in some sense. We wouldn't really be able to estimate the importance, the significance, the cultural impact of our media system if we couldn't make a judgment about whether or not it could sustain what earlier cultures, what we designate in earlier cultures as works of art. That we can call them something else, if the word art makes people nervous. But clearly, there have been systems of representation and communication and dramatic performance in older cultures that served all kinds of cultural and political and anthropological functions, but were also a kind of staging area for what we, in retrospect, call artworks. And if the media of our own society are incapable of sustaining that level of discourse, then our judgment of our own society as against, let's say, the system in Elizabethan England, whose commercial engines generated a system of serial narrative that entertained vastly and propagandized vastly, but also enabled the novels of Dickens or the novels of Thackeray. If the equivalent American system is incapable of that kind of empowerment, generating that level of complexity in dramatic discourse, that's a significant fact. And the only way we can figure that fact out is by having some aesthetic sense, some way of deciding when we're looking at a text whether or not it meets the criteria that we might designate as belonging to works of art. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a working distinction here between art and entertainment. It's just a modest working distinction. Then we'll turn to the two shows to try to. Who lent me this? Who are you?
I'm Laura.
Laura, thank you. Oh.
I got it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that's our plan for today. But let me quickly skip ahead. What we're going to do for the rest of the term is we're almost finished in a way with what I'll call sort of the framework part of the course, and I hope I've been able to do it in a way that's also kept you interested in concrete details. But one more step, which we'll take sort of next week after you've done the exam, where we talk in a more systematic way. We return to the question of ideology, of what we might call broadly sort of the political or ideological meanings that are embedded in television, and we'll sort of review how you read media texts, really all narrative texts, but how you read media texts in order to be responsive to what we might think of as their ideological or political assumptions. Not necessarily what they openly dramatize, but what they take for granted is often more important than what and what you need to focus on. So we're going to talk a little bit more next week about ideological questions and political questions, and then we're essentially going to proceed in roughly chronological fashion through television history by looking at what I will, in an almost arbitrary way, decide are representative shows. And the viewings that you'll watch on the few Wednesday evening viewings that remain will continue to try to single out episodes of particularly significant programs, culturally and artistically significant programs. And in our discourse in class, we'll look at fragments of other programs and practice and hone our powers of discrimination. And we're going to continue to jump back and forth between what I'll call aesthetic and cultural forms of interpretation, between an interest in the cultural and sociological and anthropological work the texts are doing and their potential or partial artistic interest for us. And that's so, there'll be my expectation is there'll be some text or other, some television program or other will center our discourse in almost every class from now on. All right, so let me turn back now, partly to review and partly to fortify arguments that I think I've left perhaps a little more implicit in the course so far than I would like to leave. One way to talk about the kind of preoccupation I've been describing in the last few minutes is to make a distinction between art and entertainment. And some of you are familiar with this from other courses of mine. And I don't want to overdo this, but I don't want to insist on too sharp a distinction. But one way that it's useful to think about this category is one way it's useful to imagine what art is, to demystify the category of art, to recognize that, at least the way I want to use the term, I'm not talking about something that's mystical or impossible to recognize, is to say that all art is a form of entertainment, belongs to a sort of world of entertainment, but not all entertainment attains to the complexity, to the richness of artworks. That is to say, it's an idea of artworks, and especially in terms of narrative and verbal materials. It's an idea of artworks that sees art as synonymous with forms of intelligence. It sees art as a particularly intelligent embodiment and use of the materials available to entertainment items. So in other words, it's a more valuable, a more complex, a more instructive kind of entertainment, would be one way to say it. In other words, or to put it in another way, one could say that what I'm calling entertainment is a phenomenon that will reflect and carry the beliefs of a society, but will not reflect upon them. That it carries the beliefs and attitudes and themes that it dramatizes in a way that is partly unconscious and unaware. And that the difference between an entertainment object like that and a work of art is that the work of art is aware of and takes responsibility for the subjects that are implied by its story, that for the subject matter, for the issues, the themes, the concerns that seem to be part of it. Such texts are intrinsically interesting. That is to say, they're interesting to us not only, and not even, and certainly not merely, because they reflect a culture's values, right? Which we read all artifacts as historical and anthropological objects that reveal to us something of the culture from which they grow. But the artwork has another claim on art. It has that claim on us, but it has a second claim. And the second claim is, I am intrinsically interesting. The world that I imagine, the work of art is saying, the world as it is constituted within my borders is intrinsically interesting. And if you pay attention to it, it will instruct you about the real world. It will actually, in some sense, have a level of truthfulness or complexity that will be instructive, that will be valuable. In other words, you won't simply be amused or diverted by it, you'll also be taught something by it if you pay attention to it, right? In other words, it has an intrinsic claim on our attention. These are very fast and loose distinctions, because, and the truth of the matter is, especially in popular art, that most texts are imperfect. They'll be partly, they will attain to levels of complexity and richness only in part, and in other parts won't do. And by the same token, the entertainment work, there may be certain very elegant and powerful aspects of the work of entertainment, but it still might not attain to the full richness or complexity of what I'm calling a work of art. So it's not as if the two categories are utterly separate from each other. What I'm talking about is a greater level of complexity. And I'm going to try to dramatize that difference to you by looking at these two episodes very quickly of Lucy and the Honeymooners. It's a version of what we've already said about those other two episodes, which were also very similar. That where both of the protagonists go on television and try to sell an item to the audience. They both have get-rich-quick schemes, and the plots of both episodes are very similar as well, because their scheme ends in a kind of catastrophe and physical embarrassment and physical shock. So let me take a further step back now and maybe make clear the grounds on which I would begin to think about works of art in general and television stories in particular. Many of you know this, but one of the reasons I'm mentioning it is I could hear John Romano utilizing this terminology himself, thinking that undergraduates at MIT are surely more sophisticated than than television audiences he normally writes for, and he's partly right about that, but he used some he used at least one term that many of you might find technical, and I did define it at the time, and it's something I've talked about before. He used the adjective mimetic, and he used it several times to talk about his enterprise, right? And some of you know where this comes from, but let's talk about it very briefly before we go further, because it's at the heart of it's at the heart of this term and the noun that comes from it, which I talked about earlier. These two terms, this is the adjective, this is the noun, are important for any understanding of how forms of representation operate. In other words, a theory of representation, a theory of words or texts of any kind representing the world, embodying the world, enacting the world, displaying the world. Has to be grounded in notions of mimesis. Where does the term come from? Well, actually, our English word for pantomime and for mimic and for miming derives from this Greek root. That's right, and in fact, it's helpful to realize that the source for a lot of words in our language having to do with mimicry and pantomime are connected to the word mimesis etymologically. Yes, Susanna. Yes. The source, the fundamental source of it is what is recognized to be the first systematic work of literary criticism in the Western world. The 5th century Greek philosopher Aristotle, the founder of the modern world in many ways, one of whose students took very careful notes at a lecture he gave on, mainly on comedy, and in part on drama. Those lecture notes survive as Aristotle's Poetics. And it's a relatively short text in which Aristotle tries to articulate, it's the first systematic attempt at the articulation of aesthetic principles. And at the very heart of Aristotle's Poetics is the word mimesis. He says, he's talking about the great Greek tragedies, among other texts, and he says, what the Greek tragedies enact is a mimesis of reality. And the most literal definition of the word, the most literal translation of the word mimesis would be imitation, right? So it says, a play is an imitation of reality. It imitates reality. And as Aristotle's definition goes on, what becomes clear is that his idea of mimesis is not a narrow idea which involves a kind of confining, what we might think of as a confining realism, right? In other words, when a text mimes reality, when a text imitates reality, when a text represents reality, that representation, that reimagining of it, that mimesis of it, doesn't actually have to have, in the narrow sense, a totally realistic texture. It doesn't have to mirror the world, the actual world it is mimicking in exactly every detail in order to be a sufficient and an instructive form of imitation, a form of mimesis. The advantage of the term is that it's wider and broader than the narrow term realism. And once one recognizes that, what that allows one to do is to recognize that various forms of distortion of the sort we would associate with expressionist art or with certain forms of romantic poetry, distortion in which the real world is seen in ways that are clearly not totally realistic, can still be forms of mimesis, imitation, because the world has irrational and nightmare elements, and the world that's inside our heads may not obey the exact the world of our dreams won't obey the sort of the laws of physics, but the world of our dreams is part of the human, the experiential world, and an adequate idea of mimesis, an adequate idea of art as a form of imitation would have to embrace these non-realistic elements as well, right? So that the great Kafka short story, which begins, Gregor Samsa awoke one morning after a night of uneasy dreams to find himself transformed into a gigantic insect. One of the great opening sentences in the history of literature. That's certainly not a realistic story. People are not transformed into insects in their bed, and yet it is a profound mimesis. It's a profoundly mimetic text. It's realistic in other ways. In other words, it gets to the real world, but it gets to the real world by systems of distortion. This may seem like an odd distinction to you or boring to you. Some of you understand why some of you understand now why it's a very important distinction, because the word mimesis and the adjective mimetic are often narrowed very ineffectively, most recently and disturbingly by the film critic David Bordwell, who uses the term mimesis in far too narrow a way, tries to reduce it to a form of narrow realism. So texts that are not realistic, let's say a Hitchcock movie, right, that are distorted in certain ways and have expressionist tendencies. Hitchcock's only an interesting director if you think of him as giving you a kind of nightmare fable of what the world is like, not an accurate picture of the world. Under Bordwell's narrow definition of mimesis, Hitchcock is not a mimetic director, and it's a reductive and destructive way of understanding what is a really encompassing way of understanding what artworks do. In other words, so that one fundamental side of what all narrative texts and all dramatic texts try to do is they try to create a model of the world, a picture of the world. It can't be an exact picture. The world's complexity is far too great for any text to encompass, right? But it can, in various ways, attain to some level of adequacy. When that model, when that mimesis, when that mimicry of the world attains to a level of complexity such that we say, well, that matches the world. Yes, that text isn't simply reducing some aspect of the world for a momentary diversion, but it's actually capturing something of the multiplicity, something of the complexity, something of the tangled potency of actuality. Then we say it's attained to the level of art, right? In other words, its mimesis is sufficient. Its mimesis is adequate. And as I say, it's incredibly common experience for us, especially in the movies and in television, to see a kind of partial success along these lines. To watch programs that will be very persuasive along one dimension and relatively unpersuasive along another dimension. Relatively plausible and adequately complex in one aspect, but not in another aspect. And we have to be attentive to those moments and be willing to embrace the partial excellence of popular art, the normally partial excellence of popular art. So the adjective mimetic means the mimetic dimension of a text is that dimension of the text which tries to reflect or reenact or represent reality. Okay? And there's a second dimension to the text, which we might call the mimetic dimension, the mimesis dimension of all stories are mimetic in some way, either adequately or inadequately. Right? And we might call that the content dimension, the aboutness of the text. The text is about the world, and in the ways in which it's about the world, it is behaving mimetically. Right? That's what a mimesis is: an enactment, a representation, a reimagining of the world in an aesthetic order. Right? In a play, in a poem, in a movie, in a television program, in a novel, in an oral narrative. Right? And then there's so the one fundamental dimension of a text is therefore what I sometimes would call its aesthetic dimension. It's mimetic dimension, its content dimension, and it has a second dimension which we might call its formal or its structural element. Right, the way it's put together, its various formal features. In a serious work of art, those formal features will be part of the mimesis. The structure of the text will, in some sense, contribute to and be part of what the text means, right? The form will enact the meaning. It's what we mean in a way when we talk about mastering a medium. When an artist understands that the nuances of his or her medium, when he or she exploits the medium she finds herself in with seriousness and with richness, we're watching another form of artistic mastery, right? So there are two ways to judge, and they're related, and they're interrelated. There are two ways to talk about two sort of aspects or fundamental features of any artwork or of any narrative text that we need to take account of if we were going to do a kind of evaluation of it, if we're going to try to determine whether it's a work of art or whether it's a successful or a good or a persuasive or a valid work of art. Any of those adjectives would do, right? Validity in interpretation is the standard, not perfection or purity, but validity in our own interpretations and in the text account of the world, or persuasiveness might be another term for it, right? And those two aspects are the mimetic aspect and the formal aspect. The formal aspect goes to all those questions about the text that have to do with the tools, the instruments available to the. If it's a poet, it has to do with the poet's mastery of vocabulary and of rhythm, right, and of meter, right, and of rhyme, right. And if it's a filmmaker, it would have to do not only with the filmmaker's mastery of character and story, but also with the technology of the motion picture camera and with the technology of the editing suite, right? Someone who was careless or incompetent in a technical sense could never really be a great artist. But someone who was incredibly brilliant technically but had nothing to say could not, like Hitchcock, makes Hitchcock a partial artist because he doesn't, he is technically very remarkable, but his content isn't totally stupid, but his content is perverse in certain ways, and he's not fully aware of how he's acting out his own perversities. Hitchcock's on my mind because I'm doing him today in the film course, but one could think of many other examples of the process I'm talking about, of writers or directors or television creators of television programs whose technical mastery might be said to exceed their power of understanding. And there are certain writers, Dreiser comes to mind, the great careless American genius, whose stories and whose power of myth, power to imagine myth, is much greater and more decisive than his technical prowess. And you read Dreiser. When I read Dreiser, it's like I'm reading a freshman English paper, and I can't put my red pencil down. He writes so poorly, and yet his imagination is so astounding that there's a kind of mythic power even to his most disappointing sentences. So there's an example of a writer whose imagination of his material is sufficient in one dimension, but disappointing and insufficient in a technical or structural dimension. All right. This may seem excessively theoretical to you, but it's useful, I think, to clarify because all of both elements, both the mimetic dimension of the text and its formal or structural dimension, need to be part of our discussion if we're trying to give a full account of a text's excellence or lack thereof, right? With these broad principles in mind, let's turn back to a question that we've really already settled in a way. And I thought about skipping over this, but it seems important to nail it down. And I think this is an early stage in which to do it. What I'm going to show you is a comparison, virtually like the comparison you've already seen, but from two different episodes. And I'm going to try to skip through Let's hope I can get this to work here. I'm going to try to skip through. All right, this first episode fairly quickly and just give you a brief sense of it. But both of the episodes I want you to look at from that we're going to use as our templates today are versions of what you've seen before, but I think maybe even more decisive versions. Let's see if I can make this work. Are we up on the screen? Okay. This is the beginning of an episode of I Love Lucy from the very early 50s, probably 52. we'll continue this in a second. But very quickly, I mean, and I'm not, asking you just to make fun of it, but just make some observations that seem relevant about what you've seen. How about even technically? Greg, start us off.
Oh, I was just going to make an observation of people in the scene that it's clear that they've all come over to watch television together, even though television's a really tiny box and they're sitting around watching it.
That's a good point. So we're in an era when if television itself is still a novelty item, everyone watches, and in fact neighbors come into the house that have the television to watch together. What else? Wally?
They're all fully dressed. I mean, they may as well be at the office the way they're dressed.
Yes, they're not very casual, are they? That's also interesting, and maybe in a certain sense implausible, as if there's still a sense that the program has imperfectly translated itself into a dramatic mode, which I think is always the case. Look, one of the things about television, it was always said, was intuitively understood from the very beginning, was that television was a more intimate medium than the movies, and even in some way, it had the intimacy of radio, but a much greater power because it was visual as well as auditory. And one of the effects of that sense that television was a more intimate space was that even from the very earliest days, there was a blurring of the difference between the actor and the role. And it's not uncommon for the Lucy show. Lucille Ball was a known actress. Right? She was a semi-star, not quite a big, gigantic movie, but she was on her way. If she had been born a decade earlier, she would have been presumably one of the great movie stars. Instead, television came along, and she moved into television. And in fact, there are some people who think that her career as a movie actress had reached its peak, had stalled in a way, although one can never know for sure, because her translation to icon of early television happened so relatively quickly. And she became a kind of national institution within the first few years of the show, which was one of the great. The Lucy Show and the Milton Berle Show are the two programs that probably sold more television sets than any other programs, because people bought them to watch those programs. The buzz about those programs was so incredibly great. In our discussions last week, when John Romano and Julia Dahl were speaking about contemporary television, they both, but especially Julia, who's so young that she has no memory of television's even recent past, made implicit mistakes by trying to claim that the audiences for today's television network blockbuster shows, the ones that get the best audiences, are really large. And of course, they don't remotely measure the size of the audience in the early days if we measure by proportion of sets owned. In other words, when the Milton Berle Show came on in the early 50s, or the I Love Lucy show came on, and when they tracked audiences, what they would find as many as 60, 70% of the audience would be watching that single program. By the end of the 50s, that meant almost the whole society, so that network programs that got ratings of 50 or 50 or 60 were actually getting 60% of the audience would be watching a single program. Part of that, of course, had to do with the fact that there was a limited number of choices. There were only essentially three, or at most 4 or 5 choices available, and the 4th and 5th choice were independent stations broadcasting in urban centers that had very little interesting fare to offer. So the 3 networks had very little competition. That partly explains the condition. And that's, I think, some of that's implied in what we've seen. One more obvious thing, in a technical sense. I mean, I think in a way it sort of argues for the implausibility of it. So one of the things I'm saying is that they call it the Lucy Show as a way of reminding you that this is Lucille Ball. And everyone knew that Lucille Ball was really married to a band leader named Desi Arnaz. So even though they call themselves the Ricardos and not the Arnazes on the show, there's this blurring of their identities. There's, as if there's a claim that they are really real. They're at least partly real people. We know that at some level they're fictional, but at another level we're always aware of the real Desi Arnaz and the real Lucille Ball behind the thing. And I think that element of the show is both part of its appeal, but also part of its aesthetic limitation. But there's one very obvious thing about why you feel that it's a kind of insufficiently dramatized or imagined as a drama. Yes? Yes, but I think that what you say is right, and television exploits that. Even early television exploits that sense very much. And I think another part of the appeal of Lucy, as we've suggested, is that it mirrored, in a way, the domestic environment of the audience itself. Not in the literal sense that you would necessarily watch it while you were having breakfast in the kitchen, but that the scenes dramatized, the human experiences that the show implicitly valorizes simply because it projects them, are the human experiences that the audience shared with the show. And that's another way in which television is small, domesticated. It's domesticated not only because it's literally in the house, right, and because its screen size is small. Those are all domesticating, smallening tendencies. But there are other ways in which, and in fact, televisions that accept the principle, television programs that understand this smallening tendency, this deep fundamental element of television, do better than programs that try to deny that smallness, that try to fight against it. And I think the Lucy show does reflect that in certain ways. But what about the way, what I'll call the mise en scène, what we actually see on the screen when in the scene we've just looked at? We can't take too long on this, but it's very obvious. Yes, who are you? Aaron, right. Yes, one of the things we feel if we really listen closely is that there hasn't been much attention paid to what I'll call the mimetic plausibility of what we're seeing, right? In other words, it's a very inadequate mimesis. And not that it's even a defect, because you could say the show isn't really trying very hard. It's as if it doesn't really want you to believe in the realistic situation of the. It's as if the audience. It's as if the program itself is satisfied to remain in this half-dramatized state, right? Partly because it knows that it's capable of delivering a lot of entertainment, but partly also because television is still at some level in its novelty stage, right? In the very earliest moments of its history, movie audiences were perfectly satisfied with the electrocution of an elephant and with Fred Ott sneezing, right? But as they became more adept and as they began to take this novelty item for granted and to see and to make it a part of their habitual daily or weekly rituals, they began to have higher expectations. And one could say in part that the incompletely dramatized quality, imagined quality of I Love Lucy is partly a function of that. And it was necessary in a certain way to keep those bonds loose, because Lucy had to be liberated into forms of comic behavior that her pantomime skills and her rubber face skills encouraged. And it might well be that too systematic and complete a reimagining of Lucy and Desi as a real couple trying to imagine that as a full dramatic world might inhibit the kind of freedom they wanted to let Lucy perform as they did. So what I'm pointing to, in a way I'm pointing to what I think of as an aesthetic defect, although we're also trying to explain it historically and in terms of what the star's gifts allowed. But what I was asking you about, the most obvious thing about the mise en scène, what's the mise en scène? What is put in the scene, right? It's the composition within the frame, right? It's a key word for movie criticism. Right? It's the painterly element of it. It's what's in the frame, right? And if you think about what's the frame, what is the frame like? Is it realistic? Or are they, in a certain way, it's in a modest way, it's almost credible that there'll be a television in the foreground and they'll all sit on a couch looking at it. But what's really going on there? They're displaying all four characters for the audience. There's something, in fact, profoundly unnatural about the feel of that room and about the way the characters disport themselves while he's right, even the way they dress. There's something profoundly implausible about it, because the show's not very interested in that level of plausibility. Charisse.
I thought it was kind of awkward that Lucy and Desi were split and sitting on basically the arms of the couch. Yes, it reinforces that. That's right. That's right. In other words, it's as if, again, what I'm suggesting is, I wouldn't call this, a horrific failing. But it points to what elements of the show the people creating the show and producing the show took seriously, and what elements of the show they didn't care about, were not as important. And this doesn't go to the question of whether or not Lucy is herself an entertaining performer, not at all. But it does go to the question of how persuasive and complete the mimesis of that program is. And I think what we constantly feel about the Lucy show is that the mirror keeps cracking. That we keep being reminded that we're not really watching a dramatically imagined world, that the characters are not real characters, they're just persona for Lucy and Desi, and that the plots
are not intended to illuminate reality or to tell us something about real people. They're platforms that will allow performance. And I don't want to overdo this because there are certainly
I'm very surprised that you have. How did you
there are
happen to know the
certainly
answer to all those
moments
questions?
in the Lucy show that
Well,
have
who do you think
great
you
comedy
married to?
power, and
A cunt
even
pumpkin?
sometimes violence. But let's flash forward here. So they discover that Ricky is really
history in Cuba too, you know.
apparently
Well, you're
a
certainly
genius
a lot
at quiz
smarter
shows.
than I am. I got all
Now, well, reflect on that, and let me contrast that episode with it really, in a way, its clone. Let me contrast that episode with an almost identical version of the same story on the Honeymooners, and that's part of what makes the comparison so much more interesting. It's also about how many of you have seen this episode of the Honeymooners where Ralph goes on the quiz show? None? It's one of the great works of art of the 1950s. 2 minutes. We can continue this briefly next time, but why is the Honeymooners better? I mean, you know, we could play a game, but you obviously know I think that. So why is it better? You don't think it is? Yes. Sajjan.
Desi just seems fake compared to Ralph. Ralph seems so genuine when he's up there acting.
You're right, of course, but I mean, I put it in a different way, but you're surely right. That is to say that Gleason inhabits the character. There's really a character there. It's not Jackie Gleason. It's the character he's imagining, a character who's, most of all, what makes us feel that it's so authentic. So part of it is the performance. In other words, it's another way of putting it is to say that the dramatic circumstances of the Honeymooners are more thoroughly and completely imagined, taken seriously. What is it specifically about Ralph in this scene, that especially at the end, that makes us feel that he's more believable, more real? Charisse.
I actually want to say that in both cases, you know what's going to happen. There's no question that that Desi or that Ricky is going to get it right out of a fluke, and you know that it's going to be Swanee River that comes up either as the first question or the $99,000 question. I think the difference is A, in the acting, and B, in the development of the relationship between the spouses. Because I've seen that Honeymooners episode, and I haven't seen all of that particular Lucy episode, but it seems that Alice seems like more of a believable wife in so much that she nags and
Yes.
and she's usually more reasonable
And
than Ralph.
that's right. We didn't actually. I mean, I skipped through that episode, but what you're saying is surely true about it, and we could nail it down by showing more of the interactions between Alice and Ralph. Part of the truthfulness of the show. What we're saying is that art tells the truth. That art just doesn't amuse us. It touches truths. It doesn't mean that the truths it touches are brand new. Often the truths that especially popular art reveals to us are truths we already know, but are reinforced in us or brought to the surface of our consciousness. And part of the truth, in quotes, the truthfulness of the show has to do with the interactions between husband and wife. There's real hostility and real anger in the show. Or there is appearance of real anger. In other words, the conflicts are genuine conflicts. And we sense that the relationship between Ralph and his wife has something of the ambiguity and contradictoriness that actual relations among human beings have. At least there's a hint at this. Because there are moments when, of course, they're very affectionate to each other, and other moments when they're full of hostility. And something of the same kind of complexity or layered quality, multiplicity, is true in the interactions between Ralph and his friend Norton. Again, the pattern is basically the same as the Lucy pattern, but it's treated with a much with a greater sense of the unpredictable complexity of human nature. And some of it has to do with acknowledging, again, the possibility of aggression and hostility, right? but I'm thinking especially, to come back to Sajjan's point about at the very end, what's really powerful about the end is that it isn't funny anymore, is it? Or that it's only partly funny. That you're not, that you feel uneasy and in some sense sad for what's happening to Ralph Kramden at the end of that. That is to say that what is dramatized there is an authentic sense of failure and humiliation. And when Ralph loses, he had been such a big shot, and then when he loses the power of speech at the end of the episode, what's partly going on there is an enactment of humiliation that has power for us. So what happens is the Honeymooners releases meanings, releases possibilities that are more complicated, more painful, less reassuring than the amusement that is released by the Lucy episode. And if you think again about how, in a certain sense, both comedies depend on a relatively arbitrary trick at the end, right? In the one case, it has to do with Norton's buildup of playing Swanee River before he plays any tune for Ralph. In the other case, it has to do with the fact that in a casual comment not intended to be the answer, Ricky gives the answer by mistake, right? Both are, in some deep sense, implausible. But the second, the Honeymooners strategy is deepens our sense of Ralph's humiliation and contributes in some sense, or is a reminder to us of the eccentricity and humanity of his friend Norton. Whereas the ending of the Lucy show is simply a way out of the show to leave you with a happy ending. There's something much more arbitrary. Even though both endings are arbitrary, the arbitrariness of the Lucy show doesn't lead to anything except a happy solution to the plot. Whereas the conclusion to the Honeymooners opens out into a vision of a man feeling humiliation and disappointment and trying desperately to recoup, even though he can't. The game is over. And in fact, anyone who's ever been humiliated or who's made an irredeemable mistake that can't be fixed reacts to what's happening there. It's as if what happens is that the Honeymooners moves into a realm of truthfulness. The Honeymooners moves in, not that it remains there at every moment, but it moves into and is sustained by the powerful performance, as Sajjan says, of Jackie Gleason. It moves into a realm in which what it is dramatizing are authentic human experiences, authentic human emotions, something of the psychological and moral complexity of the human world. And when entertainment gets to that level of seriousness, to that level of adequacy, when the mimesis, when the imitation of the world, when the representation of the world begins in some part to approximate something of the world's actuality, something of the world's complexity, then we're looking at what I call art. You can call it something else. You can just call it good entertainment, right? Or powerful television. You don't have to use the honorific word art if it makes you nervous. It seems to me useful to say it because I think that's what art does. That art, unlike entertainment, breaks into this world of human truthfulness. And one of the most interesting things to recognize about this program is that it's one of the very earliest programs in television history to do that. Why does that happen? Well, in 1 minute I can give you a partial answer, and I want you to reflect on this, and we'll deal with other aspects of it as the term goes on. One way to understand what's happening there is to recognize that this, as we've already implied in earlier discourse in the course, this episode of The Honeymooners, like this entire season, far from being something new that they're trying for the first time, is from one angle a culmination. They've rehearsed it and tried it out in many different ways before. In an odd way, this apparently crude program, and especially technically there's something crude about it. It's using those electronic cam, those massive electronic cam cameras. It still has to photograph straight on, as if reminding us of the staginess of the show. It retains that old-fashioned visual quality that we associate with early television, with television that hasn't fully embraced its identity as a form of film. Right? So it's not that it's a perfect show or that it's technically a total success. But even so, there is a sense in which it's a culminating example. Not only that Gleason himself on his variety shows had rehearsed many prior episodes of The Honeymooners in less than half-hour format, so that by the time they came to make that season of half-hour programs, they had done the characters many times before and had rehearsed their interactions and knew the characters, and the actors knew how to interact with each other with with an ease and a persuasiveness that comes from long practice. It's also the case that that we might think of The Honeymooners as the culminating sitcom of the first 5 or 8 years of television, of the first half decade of television, because there were a series of radio programs that influenced early situation comedies. We've mentioned some of them, the Goldbergs, Amos and Andy, right? And one of them was called The Life of Riley. It appeared in its first incarnation in 1947 or 1948, starring this vaudeville comedian, Jackie Gleason, who had his first chance in that first version of The Life of Riley to work through the conventions of situation comedy. After Gleason left that program, the show was revived before, I think, this Honeymooners episode was made, this time starring William Bendix. And it was a better, more effective program the second time round. It was filmed in Hollywood, among other things, copying The Lucy Show. And that show, too, was a kind of family sitcom that centered on the adventures of a husband and a wife. So that one can see the Honeymooners as, in a certain sense, belonging to what has already become a fairly elaborated tradition on television, but has now begun to exploit at least certain features of the medium, and especially the medium's friendliness to the complexity of the human visage. You know, great part of the meaning of this show has to do with Gleason's astonishing power to register a range of emotions with facial expressions and with his voice. So for many reasons then, including the fact that it's a kind of culminating, much rehearsed version of something, an end product that's already layered by the time it comes to be made in the 1955-56 season, The Honeymooners is not a beginning exactly so much, although it is that, a kind of beginning, because it's the first great situation comedy, but it's also a kind of ending. It marks the culmination of a certain early tradition of television sitcom. So for those reasons that are we might think of them as partly technical reasons, or at least dramatic reasons, and also because of the power of the performance and the acting, the world of The Honeymooners is a more credible, a more complex, a more mimetically adequate world than the world of I Love Lucy. And that's why I would call The Honeymooners a work of art and Lucy a remarkable entertainment. Why I would, in the end, value The Honeymooners more, even though that doesn't mean I don't think that Lucy is unworthy of attention. Well, many of these principles we will have to complicate and elaborate as the term goes on, and I hope you'll begin to exercise this kind of judgment, making these kinds of distinctions as the semester continues.